Giovanni Battista Piranesi left behind a legacy that baffles even the most expert art historians. His engravings of antique ruins are executed with such incredible detail that looking at them feels like examining high-precision photography. However, we are speaking of a time when the invention of the camera was still a century away, and the primary tools for capturing reality were a quill, charcoal, and the human eye. This paradox raises a legitimate question. Where did an 18th century artist get such supernatural accuracy? Every crack in the stone, the complex play of light and shadow, the texture of the materials, all of this looks less like an artistic interpretation and more like a dry, unbiased technical document. There is a hypothesis that these works are not merely the product of a talented graphic artist's imagination, but the trace of an ancient, now lost technology that allowed for optically perfect image capture. Official art history categorizes Piranesi, along with his famous contemporaries Hubert Robert and Giovanni Paolo Panini, as ruinists. Painters whose landscapes are considered fantasy whims designed to romanticize the decay of a great empire. They are usually dismissed as dreamers who created majestic stage sets. But if we accept this version, it becomes completely unclear why modern researchers find such frightening correspondences between these fantasies and real objects. When we compare the engravings with structures that have survived to this day, it turns out Piranesi was not inventing, he was documenting. Proportions, perspective, and the tiniest architectural elements are rendered with engineering scrupulousness. Moreover, many of the objects he depicted still exist today, though their condition has changed over the centuries, which only confirms the status of the engravings as historical evidence. However, the most interesting part is not how these buildings were drawn, but how they were built. In the images, we see traces of desolation and destruction that suggest a global cataclysm overwhelmed this region long before the artist appeared with his sketchpad. We are presented not just with old buildings, but with traces of a civilization that possessed stone processing technologies incomprehensible within the framework of the traditional historical model. Huge blocks are fitted together with jewel-like precision. Ornaments transition from one slab to another without the slightest shift. And the quality of surface polishing casts doubt on the idea that this could have been done by hand by a crowd of slaves with primitive chisels. The structures themselves, arches, walls, monuments, look alien to the people depicted next to them. The figures in the engravings, dressed in simple, sometimes tattered clothes, seem like random passers-by or inhabitants who have settled in ruins they had no hand in creating. This architecture was clearly created by someone else, and for entirely different purposes, as evidenced by the gigantic scale of the doorways and the ceiling heights, seemingly designed for beings of a different stature. The strength of these constructions is such that even after centuries of dense urban development and potential natural disasters, they continue to stand, while later buildings crumble and disappear. It seems these megalithic objects were subjected to a powerful destructive force, the nature of which is unknown to us, yet even that force could not wipe them off the face of the earth completely. We see evidence of highly advanced engineering thought, complex blueprints, load calculations, and the logistics of delivering multi-ton materials, all part of a production process that was suddenly interrupted. The official version that barbarians destroyed these grandiose complexes with sticks and stones seems less and less convincing when you look closely at the walls with their perfect masonry. When carefully examining the architectural elements captured in the engravings and comparing them with reality, the official version of history begins to crack at the seams, much like old masonry under the pressure of time. We encounter a level of material processing that decisively contradicts our ideas about the primitive tools of the past. Blocks of travertine and marble, from which these monumental structures are composed, are fitted together with such phenomenal precision that it is impossible to insert even a knife blade between them. The joints are practically invisible, creating the illusion of a monolith. Moreover, Complex ornaments and bas-reliefs often cross from one multi-ton block to another without the slightest displacement or distortion of the pattern. This suggests that either the structure was assembled first and then polished and decorated as a single unit, or the parts were manufactured with machine precision that eliminated errors down to fractions of a millimeter. To imagine that such a result was achieved through brute force, chisels, and hammers in the hands of unskilled slaves is extremely difficult. Here we see the trace of highly organized production, engineering calculations, and technologies that allowed for the effortless manipulation of hard rock. Examples of such indestructible architecture include the famous four-sided Arch of Janus, or the Pyramid of Cestius, which appear in ancient images and have survived to this day. The arch, around which dense residential housing has grown today, stands as unshakable as it did centuries ago. The quality of its execution is such that centuries and weather conditions have left almost no traces of erosion, which is characteristic of lower quality construction. The pyramid, located in Rome, is direct proof of a close intertwining of cultures and technologies that goes beyond simple imitation of the Egyptian style. This is not a decorative copy, but a full-fledged megalithic structure, erected according to the same principles of eternity as the complexes on the Giza Plateau. A particular dissonance is caused by the contrast between the majesty of these ruins and the people inhabiting them in the engravings. The figures wandering among the colossal columns and debris of cornices look like completely alien elements. These are not the builders or the masters of these palaces. They resemble refugees or survivors who have arrived at the ashes of a different, greater civilization. The artists depicted them in ragged clothes, busy searching for something in the ground, or simply sitting aimlessly at the foot of walls whose scale suppresses a human being. The height of the doorways, the size of the steps and statues, all of this is calculated for giants, not for the ordinary people huddling in the shadow of these monuments. The feeling that these tenants are simply using the remnants of past grandeur for their domestic needs, without understanding the true purpose of the buildings, intensifies with every image examined. It is impossible to ignore the nature of the damage. We are told that barbarians destroyed the ancient cities. But to inflict such damage on buildings designed by top-class engineers, a simple desire to break things is not enough. You cannot chip off a piece of granite weighing several tons with the blow of a stick. The destruction recorded in the engravings and visible today looks more like the consequences of a colossal, almost elemental energy that literally tore apart the masonry and scattered blocks like toys. However, even this force could not completely destroy the traces of the ancient architects. The most intriguing thing about these landscapes is not only what stands on the surface, but how these buildings interact with the soil. Looking at the proportions of the structures, it becomes obvious that a significant part of them is hidden from view. This is not just a foundation going deep down. These are full-fledged floors, windows, and doors that have been buried under a thick layer of soil. The ground level in the engravings, as in modern Rome, is unnaturally high, covering the lower parts of buildings that were clearly meant to be above ground. This fact leads us to the thought that these cities were not simply abandoned, but survived some global event that changed the landscape itself. When looking at the antique panoramas captured by the masters of the 18th century, attention is inevitably drawn to one strange but ubiquitous detail: the unnatural level of the ground. This is not just a layer of dust or trash accumulated over centuries, but a multi-meter layer of earth that has literally swallowed the lower floors of buildings, the bases of columns, and the pedestals of monuments. If we view these images as accurate documentation of reality rather than artistic fiction, then we are presented with a picture of the aftermath of a massive disaster. Windows, originally designed to let in light and air, have gone half or completely underground, turning into useless openings leading into solid clay. Door arches, designed for ceremonial entry, have become so low that a person has to stoop to get inside. This phenomenon, often ignored in classical descriptions, suggests that we are observing not the result of the gradual accumulation of a cultural layer, but the consequences of a sudden and catastrophic event. One gets the impression that the famous ruinists, such as Piranesi, Hubert Robert, and Panini, acted not as romantics praising decay, but as chroniclers of a post-apocalyptic world. They recorded a reality in which magnificent cities were buried under deposits of soil, brought, perhaps, by a giant wave or a mudflow. All the ruins and ancient buildings of Rome in their engravings are submerged in this layer to a depth corresponding to modern archaeological excavations. Obelisks and pyramids, towering above current street levels, stand in the same places in the engravings, but their bases are hidden, confirming that the modern ground level is significantly higher than that on which these structures were originally built. This changes the perception of the entire chronology. The catastrophe occurred not in geological epochs beyond memory, but in historical time, the traces of which were witnessed by artists of the recent past. This dissonance is especially vivid in the depiction of people. The inhabitants of the ruins, captured in the engravings, look tiny and lost against the background of cyclopean structures. These are clearly not the descendants of great builders capable of erecting pyramids and perfectly fitting granite blocks. This is, rather, a migrant population surviving on the debris of someone else's greatness. They seem frail, dressed in rags, wandering among giant debris in search of something useful, or simply existing in the shadow of walls whose purpose is likely no longer clear to them. Their way of life is primitive. They build flimsy wooden lean-tos against majestic stone walls, dry laundry on broken statues, and use the halls of ancient temples as pens for livestock. This contrast between the highest level of past technologies and the decline of the present, recorded by the artist, screams of a break in the continuity of civilizations. Moreover, the nature of the destruction of the buildings themselves raises many questions. Official history writes everything off as barbarian invasions, yet the nature of the damage speaks otherwise. Barbarians could burn wooden floors or steel decorations, but destroying monolithic stone structures, scattering multi-ton blocks like pebbles, is only within the power of the elements of incredible force, or a weapon whose operating principle is unknown to us. We see torn-out pieces of walls, split columns, and collapsed vaults that are impossible to break by hand, even with thousands of slaves with pickaxes at one's disposal. These are traces of a global force majeure that wiped a highly developed culture off the face of the earth, leaving only a stone skeleton, which was subsequently populated by people who did not possess a fraction of that knowledge. Piranesi, in essence, documented the agony of the ancient world, but he did it with such frightening accuracy that his works turned into something more than just art. They became detailed blueprints of a crime scene on a planetary scale. To convey every crack, every nuance of stone texture, and every shadow in these gloomy, earth-buried labyrinths, the artist required an instrument surpassing the capabilities of the human eye and hand. Simple drafting talent would not have been enough here. The secret of his incredible realism, bordering on photographic, lies in a unique technique where the main role was played not by brush and paint, but by metal and corrosive acid. To solve the riddle of the supernatural accuracy of these images, it is necessary to step away from mystical theories and immerse ourselves in the harsh reality of the artist's workshop, filled with the smells of varnish, metal, and acrid fumes. What the modern viewer takes for the result of optical instruments or lost photographic technologies is actually the pinnacle of etching technique, a type of intaglio printing that Piranesi turned into true alchemy. This is not just drawing with a pen on paper, where a mistake can be erased or painted over. This is an uncompromising struggle with matter, where the image is born as a result of a chemical reaction of acid corroding metal. The process of creating these engraving masterpieces was incredibly labor-intensive. and required not only artistic genius, but also an engineering mindset. First, a copper plate was covered with a layer of acid-resistant varnish. Then the artist, armed with a sharp steel needle, literally scratched through this layer, exposing the metal. Every movement had to be precise, as the needle forgives no inaccuracies. It is here that the secret lies of that very sketch-like liveliness and dynamics that distinguishes etching from rigid and dry-line engraving. The needle glides over the varnish with the ease of a quill, allowing the master to create complex interweavings of lines, imitating cracks in stone, the texture of crumbling plaster, or the wild vegetation taking over the ruins. However, the real magic began later, when the prepared plate was immersed in a bath of nitric acid. The liquid began to corrode the copper only in those places where the varnish had been removed by the needle. The depth and width of the future line on the print depended exclusively on the time the plate spent in the acid. Piranesi brought this stage to perfection using the method of multi-stage etching. He would take the plate out, cover the areas that needed to remain light and thin, for example, the background or clouds, with varnish, and submerge the metal in the acid again to deepen the shadows and make the foreground lines deep and saturated. This process could be repeated many times, creating a real relief on the flat sheet of copper. It was this complex layering that allowed for the effect of incredible volume and atmospheric perspective. Thousands of strokes, crossing at different angles, created a thick, velvety blackness of shadows, from which, as if under the beams of a spotlight, the illuminated details of the architecture emerged. Subsequently, during printing, the grooves were filled with ink, and under the colossal pressure of the press, damp paper literally pulled the pigment out of the metal channels. Thus, images were born with the highest contrast and density of detail, unattainable for ordinary drawing. Piranesi used this technical arsenal to imitate the tangible materiality of the world. His stone seems heavy and cold, and his marble, smooth and eternal. The artist did not just copy the visible, he directed light and shadow, turning ruins into grandiose theatrical sets. In his famous series, Prisons, this technique reached its apogee, creating a sense of infinity and claustrophobia simultaneously, where stairs lead nowhere and vaults disappear into frightening heights. This was not a mechanical copying of reality with a camera obscura, but a manic recreation of the world's texture through chemistry and physics. He forced acid to work for eternity, etching the memory of a great past into metal. Such meticulousness and dramatic presentation played an unexpected role. The engravings ceased to be merely collector sheets and turned into a powerful instrument of influence. The image of majestic, monumental Rome created by Piranesi turned out to be so convincing and infectious that it stepped over the borders of Italy and began to shape the tastes and ambitions of the most powerful rulers of Europe, radically changing the architectural appearance of cities thousands of kilometers from the Eternal City. The visual language created by Giovanni Battista Piranesi proved so powerful that it transcended the boundaries of art and became a tool of high politics. His engravings, saturated with the pathos of imperial grandeur and eternity, turned into a kind of manifesto for monarchs dreaming of creating their own eternal cities. Piranesi did not just depict Rome. He constructed an ideal image of state power, heavy, invincible, and overwhelming in its scale. This aesthetic code was instantly read by the most ambitious rulers of Europe, who saw in the dramatic black and white sheets ready-made blueprints for their empires. Napoleon Bonaparte, obsessed with the idea of reviving Roman glory, was one of the most passionate admirers of the master's work. For the French emperor, Piranesi's engravings served not just as interior decoration, but as visual confirmation that power could be materialized in stone in a way that would survive millennia. However, the Italian graphic artist left an even deeper and more unexpected mark on the banks of the Neva River. The Russian Empress Catherine II, known for her refined taste and desire to give Russia a European gloss, was under a huge impression of Piranesi's works. In her correspondence and orders, one can trace a clear desire to transfer Roman monumentality to the swampy soil of St. Petersburg. The connection between Piranesi and the architectural appearance of the northern capital turned out to be not just ideological, but direct and immediate. Many outstanding architects who created the look of St. Petersburg, Giacomo Quarenghi, Charles Cameron, Vasily Bazhanov, either knew the master personally, were in active correspondence with him, or were under the hypnotic influence of his paper architecture. What Piranesi etched with acid on copper in his Roman workshop was years later cast in cast iron and carved in granite on the embankments and squares of Russia. Architectural researchers often note that in some elements of St. Petersburg decor, we encounter not just inspiration, but direct citation bordering on plagiarism. If you carefully study the grilles of bridges, lanterns, fence ornaments, and building facade decor of that era, you can discover a frightening resemblance to elements depicted in Piranesi's etchings. Heavy chains, lion masks, specific geometric patterns, and the general severity of forms, all of this was transferred from engravings to reality almost without change. In fact, walking today through the historic center of St. Petersburg, we are walking inside the materialized fantasies of Piranesi. The city, built on the edge of the earth, absorbed the spirit of ancient cyclopean ruins that the Italian loved to depict so much. Architects of the Catherine and Paul eras saw in Piranesi's works the perfect balance between classical severity and emotional expressiveness. They borrowed from him not only decorative elements, but also the very sense of space, grandiose, solemn, and slightly gloomy. It was thanks to this influence that Russian classicism acquired that special, heroic intonation that distinguishes it from lighter European analogues. Piranesi, who had never been to Russia, became one of the main co-authors of its imperial style, proving that ideas captured on paper can be more durable than stone. However, among the entire variety of architectural forms that Piranesi documented and thereby immortalized, there is one structure that stands apart. It appeared in his works with enviable regularity, as if magnetically attracting the artist's attention with its mystery and non-conformity to usual construction norms. This building does not just amaze with its scale. It rests on a foundation that looks so ancient and technologically perfect that it seems to have existed even before the appearance of Rome itself, surviving epochs and cataclysms that erased everything else. Among the multitude of antique monuments that Giovanni Battista Piranesi transferred to paper with manic precision, one structure occupies a special place, causing the greatest number of disputes and doubts in official chronology. We are talking about the Mausoleum of Hadrian, better known to contemporaries as Castle Sant'Angelo. If we view the master's engravings not as artistic fantasies, but as technical documentation, this building appears before us not merely as an emperor's tomb, but as an indestructible bunker erected based on technologies that seem impossible for the beginning of our era. Piranesi paid close attention to this object, returning to it again and again, as if trying to solve the secret of its inhuman stability. The central element causing bewilderment is the foundation and the megalithic platform on which the main cylindrical tower rests. In the engravings, particularly in cross-sections and plans, it is clearly visible that the base of the mausoleum is composed of giant blocks of travertine, a stone comparable in hardness and processing difficulty to granite. These blocks are fitted to each other with ideal density, without the use of binding mortar, which is characteristic of so-called polygonal masonry found in the most ancient structures of the planet. The scale of these slabs is such that their weight is measured in tens, if not hundreds, of tons. Official history claims that construction took place in the 130s AD, but the appearance of the base suggests that the mausoleum was erected on the ruins of something much more ancient and grandiose, existing long before the Roman Caesars. The internal arrangement of the structure, captured by Piranesi, also amazes with its engineering complexity. Particular attention is drawn to the room that was used in the Middle Ages as a hall of justice. The entrance to it and the walls themselves are made of massive blocks, on the surface of which the artist carefully drew specific protrusions. These technical details, often ignored by laymen, are of great importance. They were used for gripping and lifting blocks during construction. However, their presence on stones of such size implies the use of powerful lifting mechanisms, cranes, or manipulators, and certainly not ropes and wooden scaffolding. The arch above the entrance is reinforced with powerful side supports designed for the colossal pressure of the stone masonry above, which indicates a deep understanding of the laws of material resistance, going beyond empirical experience. The history of the building's exploitation only confirms its unique characteristics. Originally conceived as a tomb for the imperial family, this object survived the fall of Rome, turning into an impregnable fortress. In the 10th century, it became the citadel of the Crescenzi family, and later, a refuge for popes and even a prison. The fact that the structure withstood numerous sieges, earthquakes, and alterations speaks of a limitless margin of safety. Piranesi, as well as his teacher Giuseppe Vazzi, depicted this castle from different angles, and the same picture can be traced everywhere. A powerful, as if cast in one-piece skeleton that cannot be destroyed by the ordinary weapons of that time. Comparing 18th century engravings with the modern look of Castle Sant'Angelo, researchers come to the conclusion that Piranesi did not exaggerate. He perhaps even downplayed it, trying to fit what he saw into the framework of his contemporaries' understanding. The author of the engravings deliberately emphasized the underground part of the foundation and the huge vertical buttresses, showing that the visible part is only the tip of the iceberg. Today's tourists see the same structure, but often do not notice the details that the engraver highlighted so scrupulously. The perfect geometry of the joints, and the massiveness unnatural for antiquity. This is not just architecture. This is fortification, designed to withstand forces whose power we can only guess at. Thus, we have verified that the objects depicted in the etchings are absolutely real and exist in the physical world. We have understood the complex etching technique that allowed the artist to achieve the effect of documentary photography. We have seen that these documents confirm the presence of technologies that do not fit into history textbooks. But behind all this technical and architectural accuracy lies something more. Piranesi was not a simple copyist of reality. In his persistent, almost obsessive desire to capture every stone and every crack, a specific message shines through. The main question that now stands before us is, what exactly was he trying to communicate to his descendants by leaving these detailed reports of a lost civilization? Giovanni Battista Piranesi is not just a talented artist whose rich imagination gave birth to bizarre architectural dreams. This definition, convenient for academic science, crumbles to dust the moment his works are compared with reality. Before us stands a scrupulous documentarian, an unbiased chronicler of a bygone era who was perhaps one of the last conscious witnesses to the grandeur of a civilization practically wiped off the face of the earth. His engravings serve as the only reliable bridge across the abyss of time, connecting us to a world we have lost, or, even more frighteningly, deliberately forgotten. Every line on his etchings, etched by acid into metal, is a desperate attempt to preserve the memory of technologies and scales that today seem like science fiction. The master himself loved to repeat the enigmatic phrase, "I make the stones speak." And if one listens carefully to this stone language, it tells a story radically different from the soothing lines in school textbooks. This narrative is not about gradual progress from primitive to complex, but about a global catastrophe, about the highest level of ancient engineering art, and about how fragile the world can be, even if it is built of granite and marble. Piranesi did not invent ruins for the sake of a pretty picture. He resurrected them, recording their near-death state, not letting them disappear completely into oblivion, under multi-meter layers of earth and later urban development. His works are a bold visual challenge to time and our modern complacency. They serve as a silent reproach, reminding us that our civilization, with its achievements, might be just a pale shadow of what existed on this planet millennia ago. Today, when genuine antique monuments are lost among bright neon signs, billboards, and endless tourist bustle, views of Rome remain the standard of truth. They are physical proof that history could have developed according to a completely different scenario. Cyclically, through rises of incredible power and falls into dark ages about which we were simply forgotten to be told. To treat these works as artistic fiction means deliberately closing one's eyes to inconvenient details, to the buried first floors, to the polygonal masonry that is impossible to replicate, to the glaring discrepancy between human height and giant doorways. Piranesi teaches us the main skill of a researcher, not to blindly trust authorities and approved official interpretations, but to look at the world with wide open eyes. He calls on us to pay attention to small things, strokes, and inconsistencies, which often hide the most grandiose secrets of our past. These engravings are not just art. They are keys to understanding who we really are and whose heritage we are trampling underfoot. If you are ready to continue asking uncomfortable questions, to seek answers that are not accepted in the academic environment, and if you are interested in the real riddles of history rather than their simplified versions, then this investigation is just the beginning of the journey. Beyond the scope of public platforms remains a huge layer of information, rare archival images, and bold theories that shed light on the real picture of events and help put the historical puzzle together. In a special private channel, we publish exactly such materials, things that are not customarily spoken aloud. Join the community of like-minded people, share your opinion, and remember, the truth is often hidden not in words, but in stones that know how to speak, if one finds the right approach to them.